Hello everyone, welcome to our Faculty for a Future launch event. I'm Alison Green and I'm one of the academic leads for Faculty for a Future. I'd like to start by thanking you all for coming to this webinar, wherever you might be. If you're curious, I'm actually in Cambridge in the UK at the moment. So in developing this first webinar, one of the things we wanted to do was progress a conversation with you that has been started in a number of places. It's been stimulated in large part by some of us concluding that we academics cannot go on like this and that something has to change. Now, at this point, feeling that we don't yet know quite what to do is fine. We're here to try to facilitate and to hold those conversations. Some of you are already taking action, from teaching your students about the intersecting crises to radically reorienting your research to focus on humanity's predicament. Perhaps like many, though, you're not very sure about what options are available to you for taking action. And taking action can feel like quite an uncomfortable first step, especially if those around you are carrying on as usual. We've developed a number of ways to show you how you can take action and how you can get involved with us. And we'll have more to say about how you can get involved later. So the structure of the event today is that you will hear some brief presentations from my colleagues, from Wolfgang Knorr, from Laurie Laybourn-Langton, from James Dyke, and from myself. And each short presentation will be followed by a brief Q&A, during which you'll be able to put questions to each of us. And then Raine, who's the director of the project, will say a little bit about each of our core areas. And then we'll open the floor up for a longer Q&A session towards the end. So I'll hand over now to Jordan, who directs Faculty for a Future. And Jordan led our successful bid for funding from BKRF. He's the inspiration behind the project, and he's done a huge amount of work to shape each of our hubs.
We're here to talk about, candidly, the precarious world we're entering into and academia's own part in this messy decline in the planet's health, and crucially, what we can all do to rise to our future-defining challenge. And I just want to emphasize from the top that if you're feeling uneasy at our trajectory and academia's role in it, then you're not alone. From our work so far and from the conversations that I've had, it's clear that there are thousands in and around the academic sphere who want to do something more. And our focus at Faculty for a Future is connecting people around that work and making it easier across these three core areas of academic life: research, teaching, and engagement. Before we get into the long grass, I just wanted to give a very brief introduction of how I came to be directing Faculty for a Future. So my story is that I used to be an academic. I left after my PhD. I then went into investigative environmental journalism and later became environment editor at The Conversation UK, which, for those of you that don't know, pairs editors with academics to produce accurate and engaging analysis and commentary. But I had to publish about one article a day. And I remember one week in October 2019 with a flurry of particularly heavy news. I think the first one was this IPCC Ocean and Cryosphere report, which said essentially that things are worse than we thought, and actually that the report itself was more conservative than the reality. There's another article about how climate instability is knocking the natural world out of sync. And then another one around how hundreds of millions more people were at risk from yearly coastal flooding than we previously thought. And I just felt so helpless in that week. I felt at a loss as to what to do. I was increasingly struggling with simply reporting on the world as it felt like it was crumbling around me. And during my time there, as I went about my work, perhaps unsurprisingly, I found that this is a feeling that so many people in academia are feeling too, particularly those in the environmental space who have seen their warnings of crisis ignored for years. There's a huge amount of worry and fear out there at how far away we are as a society from even understanding the challenge in its entirety, let alone responding to it. And lots of the academics that I met were struggling with their professional role in that light. One of them is on this call. His name is Wolfgang Knorr. And I worked with him on an article about how, as a climate scientist, he felt his profession was letting down humanity. I've got to be honest, I actually found that concept quite jarring at first, but we stayed in touch. We wrote a few more articles together, and eventually we decided to see what we could do to help academia catalyze these increasingly common feelings of unrest into something more constructive.
This is really a milestone here, this event today. And for myself personally, as well as for the team, I think, and I hope you will understand that after the short introduction to my personal journey here, that I hope can serve a little bit of an explanation of what we want with Faculty for Future. So I've been a climate scientist now for 30 years. I entered climate science from physics in 1992, and that was the year of the Rio conference. The Rio conference, for those who don't remember, it was a huge international event, and it basically kicked off the entire climate policy process that we know today, the UNFCCC, the COPs, the IPCC reports, everything that was all kicked off then, and the same for the biodiversity sphere. And at that time, that was a really big motivator for me. I wanted to do something that was closer to nature and something that was meaningful for humanity. But I also have to say that I generally love the natural sciences for the wonders of nature that, as a scientist, you observe. And so in the beginning, that worked really quite well. I felt thrilled. I was satisfied to be in this new environment. But then certain things start setting in, and I hope that there's something for you all to learn from this. Basically, one thing that set in more or less was that for this sense of wonder and awe and the sense of care for the natural environment, in the day-to-day workings of academia, I couldn't really find a home for that. That was one thing. And the other thing is that, ironically, moving to the environmental sciences in some way made this unease even worse. And that leads for me to the kind of the main point of what I want to say here. Basically, as a climate scientist, day in, day out, I was reading, writing, or reviewing statements and texts around, this is this big environmental problem that we have to solve, and we need to do research and do that, and then we can find a solution, all that and that stuff. And that kind of ritual never really changed over all the decades. And at the same time, the numbers on our screens as climate scientists were going up. So just to give you an example, doing my PhD, I worked with measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas causing planetary heating. At the beginning of my PhDs, these values were in the lower 350s. By the end of my PhD, they were around 360. Now they're way past 400, and we haven't seen these kind of numbers, not for millions of years on planet Earth, but for tens of millions of years. And that is really, really scary. But of course, scary is not a scientific term. And you can say that at a conference presentation, that it scares you, but you never say that in a paper, in a report, and never gets into the IPCC, or never gets communicated to policymakers that something is scary. So, in other words, that kind of rhetoric, oh, here, this is the impending doom, the crisis, and we have to do something about it. It's used, in your paper, in the introductory section of it, in your grant application, that's it. So that kind of rhetoric basically fossilized into something meaningless. And there's one detail I just don't want to spare you, is that actually, at least during my PhD, sort of at the beginning of my work, I actually averaged out the global mean. So I actually subtracted the global mean. So it went out of the way in the way I analyzed the data. So that kind of protected me, sort of this specialization you always do in academia protected me from actually seeing this. So all that taken together, for me, basically what that did is, in the end, I just couldn't stand the pretense. And I decided to basically wind down my career and look for something else until I met Jordan, and we're here and all that. But that doesn't need to concern you so much, because we don't necessarily want you to give up being an academic. But the starting point for me then, that really brought me here, is we, at least as climate scientists, I feel very strongly we have nobody else to blame but ourselves for the inaction and the gap between words and things that are actually being done. And I think that this is my main point, really, is that we have failed as scientists to embody the urgency that's popping up on our screens and the data tells us, because the urgency only lives in these words, in the contents of what the research we do, or we put that into reports, that in the numbers or whatever, but we don't embody it. And as long as we don't do that, nothing will change. And that's my firm opinion. And just like a last anecdote, my from PhD advisor, Martin Heimann, who's also was very, very much pioneering the carbon cycle research, he once pointed out to me that, you know, the IPCC in the climate treaty talks about preventing dangerous climate change, but danger is not a scientific concept. Yeah, but what then? If climate scientists cannot talk about danger, because it's an emotional thing, you know, if you feel danger or not, then who else is? Who can actually capture entire crisis? So something has to be changed here, and that's why I'm basically here. And I hope, you know, I'm seeing Alison come back, and yeah, I hope you will learn more about the things you can do yourself to change things.
My work is focused on the challenge facing emerging leaders who are in the millennial and Gen Z generations from the deepening environmental crisis. And that work brings me in touch with a lot of people who are, from their generational perspective, being very frank about the huge complexities that we are already facing and we will increasingly face into the future. And I was drawn to that work because I was becoming increasingly frustrated, not just at the lack of an emergency response from leaders, but also the lack of a conversation about the complexities as they will evolve in front of us. And I'd like to share some thoughts on that now, which may be useful for our conversation. I'd like to start off, though, with anchoring us in a bit of a story. I'd like us to cast our minds back to the Canadian summer, the North American summer of last year, and to the village of Lytton, which some of you may have come across, because Lytton was almost nearly completely destroyed in the wildfires that occurred during the extraordinary heatwave event that we saw in North America, itself made far more likely by the climate crisis. The destruction of the village made the news, made a lot of news around the world. But what didn't make the news was the lack of appropriate emergency response and the extraordinary story of the First Nations community that were affected in and around Lytton. What also didn't make the news was the enduring impacts experienced in the region, including later in the winter, when similarly extraordinary floods washed through the region, and because the fires had damaged the landscape, meant that there was a lot of erosion, which impacted the recovery of the village. But it also, another thing that wasn't in the news, impacted the ability for trade to pass across Canada, because it washed away railroads and roads as well. And that disruption to trade interacted with the existing disruption from COVID-19. And I think that story, all of the things that were largely missed from the wider consciousness of those events of last summer, kind of give us a window into the emerging chapter of the environmental crisis, which in many ways we are still in. That's a chapter not just characterized by growing physical risks, like the heat extremes that we're seeing around the world, like we've been seeing in India and Pakistan and other countries at the moment, nor is it one just characterized by so-called transition risks, those coming from, for example, companies not divesting fast enough or risking reputations as a result of not being a part of a fast transition. It is a new chapter characterized by systems risks, by the kind of cascading impacts that we saw in the context of North America, that we're seeing now with cascading impacts in the food system. It is a world of huge complexity and greater, more generalized threats and risks. And that current trajectory, or the current trajectory we're on, will mean that that complexity grows, that those systems risks grow. We know that we're on the trajectory for overshoot above the 1.5 degree target. Only 4% now of IPCC, some IPCC modeling looks at non-overshoot scenarios. Impacts in some areas are worse than we expected at this moment, and the adaptation gap is still very large. Those vulnerabilities are large. That's creating a more unstable world, not just a sequence of progressively more destructive events, but a new era of extraordinary complexity. Within that, there are scope for destructive societal feedback loops, of vested interests running riot, of policy responses that aren't appropriate enough, of fear overcoming us. And of course, there are extraordinary possibilities for constructive feedback loops, of rapid growth, of movements, of ideas spreading, of different modes of power overcoming entrenched power in other places. So as we enter this new world, we've got to ask what our role is within that world. The old ways, the old ideas, the ways of organizing, the ways of thinking and doing could become another stranded asset, like the physical stranded assets, the power plants that we can no longer use and so on, the infrastructure that's no longer fit for purpose. Old ways of doing, of thinking and organizing could themselves become stranded assets. My work looks at leadership. I think current leadership from political leaders is already in many ways a stranded asset at the moment. But I think that kind of frame is relevant for academia as well. What ways of doing research are best placed for the current moment, let alone the years to come, the way of engaging with populations and policymakers, the ways of collaborating across disciplines and so on. And it's a huge pleasure to be here for someone who's largely in the policy and political space, to be around for the launch of the faculty, because they are grappling fundamentally with those questions of what it means to be in this more complex era and what it means to do things slightly differently.
We have one question here for Laurie, which I'll just read out. So it's about systemic risk, and the question is, do you see any meaningful systemic risks here for academia as an institution if it doesn't orient itself towards navigating a more resilient and sustainable and fair future?
It's a great question. I think that we can think about the risks facing academia, or we could, in terms of things like reputational risk, particularly to my work. I'm in policy research, the relevance to policymakers as time goes on. As we head into a more unstable future, and it becomes obvious to everyone that leaders, political, business, so on, did not deliver the emergency action that was clearly required, there could be a reckoning, might be too strong a term, but increasingly strident questions about how it was allowed to get to this. And while academia in many respects has been on the front line of warning, there are obviously the issues that we heard in Wolfgang's presentation. And my concern is that into the future, there is academia could get caught up in that increasing questioning about how it was allowed to get to this, even if you just by association of people casting around to try and understand why leaders allowed it to get to this point. I think what would help there is changes in which academia is even more in touch with the severity of the situation we face and all its complexities. And that could, for example, include a broader range of communications. This is something that we desperately need in the policy and political space, is a kind of a new class of climate or environmental communications, which is able to say, there are deep, complex connections between a environmental crisis that spans beyond just, so quote unquote, the climate element, into then these cascading risks that we're seeing in societies at the moment. And this is particularly relevant right now. We have a broadcast journalist in the UK who is getting attacked by the relevance in the media for making inferences, broad brush statements about certain events in the rest of the world, particularly when it comes to food availability in certain countries. And we will never be able to get to the point where we can presumably definitively say that it is purely because of the environmental crisis that we've had a certain complex cascade through society that has then impacted food and then politics and so on and so forth. But we've got to get to the point where we can communicate about that better. And I think academia has a huge role in there, and that helps minimize some of those risks.
Great, thank you. And the second question has come in. There's so much complexity to incorporate here. Have you seen any frameworks out there that help researchers weave interlocking crises into their work? And what are we missing to help us do that?
A fantastic question. the first thing to say is that we're still in the foothills of the journey to properly incorporate that complexity. There are many who are doing a very good job in setting further out on that journey. There are a number of academic studies, which I can share after this, from people who are associated with the IPCC process to try and introduce frameworks that could be used not just in an IPCC setting, but further afield on how we can incorporate these complex, interconnected, cascading risks. I would thoroughly recommend reading the global assessment reports of the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. They released one in 2019 and one again this year, which looks at the state of complex, cascading, interconnected risks around the world at the moment. But I would urge people to try and contribute to what needs to be a sort of wider process of breaking down the silos that exist in academia to create these blended methods of looking at and then crucially communicating risk to policymakers. It's very important that we transmit that even further afield out of academia into applied policy, because from my experience in the policy world, we don't have enough of a recognition among policymakers, even of the existence of that complexity, let alone what the implications are, let alone what the policy responses need to be. And if that did happen, we would, well, in many respects, underline what we should be doing anyway. It would further lower the threshold in people's minds of what is seen as acceptable environmental change, and underline the need for emergency mitigation and adaptation strategies that are fully complementary with that.
Obviously a very interesting discussion because we've more questions coming in. So universities face risks with respect to their infrastructure being damaged and their exposure to financial risks through investments in the fossil fuel industry, as well as reputational risks. Could you say a little bit more about those issues?
Yeah, I strongly agree. It's not something I'm an expert on. Particularly when it comes to fossil fuel investments, which I think connect also back to reputational risks as well in student satisfaction we've seen and so on and so forth. There needs to be a process of any institution in society understanding that as we enter deeper into this new chapter of the environmental crisis, they have got to properly see how the risk of this new chapter saturates everything and permeates through reputation into the physical risk associated with buildings, as we're hearing there, through to financial investments, through to the very business model that universities have, something that we saw challenged in the context of the coronavirus pandemic and so on. And it is incumbent upon any institution in society, but particularly academia, because of its crucial role in investigating, inspecting, and communicating on the environmental crisis, to be at the vanguard of understanding those risks, of understanding that this is not just a set of events, connected or disconnected. It is a new era, and it means that that new era needs to, our reaction to it needs to be a recalibration of how we think about this as something involving deep risks that connected to all of our work, to our physical and more intangible assets that we have. And more of that work is beginning, but we're still in the early days yet.
There's one question that has come in is about your work, which is on what leadership skills are needed for the future. And this is very interesting. In many ways, of course, universities are prepping thousands of tomorrow's leaders. But what skills do you think students need equipping with to navigate the future? And what was your university experience like? And how much does teaching need to transform, and in what way?
Great question. And I'd like to introduce a bit of a frame here that might be useful to think about this. We could maybe crudely split up the past and the present into different kind of mitigation adaptation periods, where certain styles of leadership were delivered, some probably shouldn't, and they weren't. And right now we're in a situation where a lot of people are talking about the leadership that's needed right now, of certain leadership in the policy space. So, unencumbering states so they can spend the right amount of money, and to regulate properly, to ban things when necessary, going against the grain of the orthodoxy. The need to have an inner transition within ourselves psychologically to become reconnected as within nature, to recognize we are all one within nature and so on. And I think there's more and more of that being said, and I strongly agree with it, and those things are sorely needed. What I'm thinking from a generational perspective, for those who are going through university now, or those who are sort of entering into their mid-career like I am, is what on top of what I should see is what should already be happening with leaders now. On top of that, what will be appropriate for mitigation adaptation periods into the future? Because this was left too late, we are going to get more impacts into the future. What type of leadership will be needed under those conditions? And that's a very hard thing to comprehend. And in many ways, for me, that's an even deeper psychological leap. It means straddling, like sitting on a horse. It's very easy to slip one way towards a kind of muscular optimism, often making big bets on technological solutions and so on, and very much stuck within the old ways of thinking and doing. It's also very easy to slip over the other side of the horse, toward much more of a deep fatalism bordering on the misanthropic. And to have the inner resilience to sit on that saddleback, to maintain a balance that stops you from slipping either side as the ride gets bumpier is an absolute core part of what is needed. And those require very difficult discussions, because they can often be misconstrued as giving up or giving license to other interests. But it's that kind of frankness that I think we need as we build our strategies to drive a better and faster transition in increasingly difficult times.
So another question is around the systemic risks. Do you see any meaningful systemic risks here for academia as an institution if it doesn't orient towards navigating a more resilient and sustainable and fair future?
I think there are a range of risks. I think these go for many areas of society that are associated with being at the forefront of understanding and talking about the environmental crisis. There's a reputational one. There presumably could be a moment in the future, a kind of reckoning moment, to use brutal language like this, where populations turn around and say, hang on a minute, the world seems pretty broken. How was it allowed to get to this? And in that very dangerous political moment around the world, you can get all sorts of perverse blowback. And it won't necessarily be the case that people will turn around and say, yes, well, the scientists and others in academia were saying this, and you leaders over here are clearly the ones to blame. Actually, it could be a far more fractious and dangerous situation. And I think there's ways that we can preempt that academia can preempt the types of the reputational blowback or complexities that come from a moment in the not too distant future. It's already happening now, where people are saying, well, hang on a minute, how was it allowed to get to this point? And then I think there's sort of more tangible, sort of hard risks as well of business models, of way of getting research funded, even down to like I was saying, the potential for whole ideological constructs, ways of doing analysis that are just rudely exposed as not as effective or inappropriate in the face of a world that is creaking under the tumult of these growing systemic risks and shocks that are happening in other areas.
Great, thank you, Laurie. I think we've time for one more question before we move on. So universities, of course, face risks with regard to their infrastructure being damaged and their exposure to financial risks through investments in the fossil fuel industry, as well as reputational risks. Could you speak a little more to those issues? And this is sort of quite timely, given that right at this moment, there are students sitting outside Cambridge, the BP Institute in Cambridge and the Business School in Oxford.
Yeah, I mean, well, and so you see those risks are already live now. And as I was saying in the answer to my last question, you can sort of extrapolate that further into the future, and I think a really important dimension to add here in the context of academic communities that are international, that are ostensibly there to speak for human knowledge and human development, that we have got to get far better at ensuring the stories of those who are on the front line of this world are at the very forefront of how we perceive, for example, I've been talking about risk, how we perceive and understand risk. When you develop a more systems frame of the risk that we're experiencing globally, it means that we further open up our ability to properly appreciate the lived experience of being on the front line, of the grinding impacts on poverty, on nutritional outcomes, on the true nature of forced displacement, which is not the sort of horrific zero-sum imaginary created by certain, what I would call eco-nativist type political frames. It is one of internal displacement, of continued suffering, of a lack of, further underlining the lack of support from countries in the global north. It is absolutely critical that into the future, as we grapple even more with the huge complexities and the risks that come from that resulting from the environmental crisis, that those communities who are living them right now are at the very forefront of how we communicate this, at the forefront, of course, of policy and politics, but they're also at the very forefront of research, of collaborations, and absolutely of teaching, and also the enjoyment of the benefit of those teaching opportunities. And for me, that is one of the potentially the greatest risks that we're facing here, is that we continue under the trajectory we've been in the past, which is largely to treat this from the perspective of the global north. And we have suffered on that for hundreds of years now, not just the last number of decades, the last many hundreds of years. And at this crucial moment where the environmental crisis is really beginning to create larger, more systemic risks and so on and so forth, we have got to break that paradigm and flip it around to the way that it has to be right now.
Why am I here? Well, like Wolfgang, I'm going to assume, like many of you, I am scared. I am fearful for the future. I'm fearful, certainly for my children's future, potential future grandchildren, future generations. All the indicators seem to be going in the wrong direction, notwithstanding some of the promising rhetoric that we are bombarded with on a regular basis. So yes, I'm scared, but I think I'm here because we can do better. I think I can do better. Academia can do better. We can take a much more positive role, maybe it's sometimes a central role, in leading the transition to a much safer, a more just world. I think it's fair to say that we face a set of complex, entangled social, environmental challenges that we're desperately groping with, not just how to find the solutions, but actually even to understand what these challenges actually are. And in many instances, academia, whilst it should be at the forefront of generating the knowledge to address those challenges, is woefully inadequate for a range of reasons. That could be historic, that could be issues around how knowledge has been generated, how resources have been generated, could have issues about colonial injustice, about the appropriation of resources and continued knowledge in some respects. It could be about the increased marketization of universities, increased managerialism. Each university in each region will have its own kind of list of why academia isn't really stepping up to the plate. And so one thing I'm very optimistic about in Faculty for Future is we can begin to understand the cultural barriers, the institutional barriers that I think in many instances are actually holding us back. A very brief personal story of kind of how I got here today is that about 10 years ago, my science with Earth system science still, but a planetary science, did some work on astrobiology projects, childhood dreams, thinking about life on other planets and how we may be able to detect them. But given my exposure and just increasing awareness of what we're doing to this particular planet down here on Earth, I became increasingly concerned. And so over the last 10 years or so, I've sort of moved from a largely physical sciences, complex systems, numerical simulation, research and teaching, to one that's much more, let's say, interdisciplinary. Universities like to talk about interdisciplinary research and teaching, but goodness me, it's still very, very hard to do. Still feels that somehow I've got to keep some of the things I do under the radar. And so I work with a broader set of academics, social scientists, and increasingly, although I don't really like this word, with the community, people in the real world facing real world sustainability challenges. I think that the trigger for that transition was a conversation I had about a decade ago with then a very senior member of the IPCC. And it was one of those kind of off the record, at the end of a workshop, informal chat over a beer. And I asked them, so how much warming are we going to see by the end of the century? And I was expecting quite a political answer, quite a guarded, measured response, given that this was a senior member of the IPCC and there are certain things you would expect that person to be able to say, and other things they would be a little bit more reticent. And they just straight out and said 3 degrees, at least. That's where the system seems to be going. And so I asked them, but that's where we're going. We're not going to get there, right? Because at 3 degrees Celsius, what about coral reefs or the Amazon rainforest? What about people exposed to climate change impacts, increased heat waves, more devastating storms, sea level rise? And he looked at me and with a sad smile simply said, they will die. And for me, that was the moment where not just a penny dropped, but I realized that if I had interests, or maybe I had some kind of role to play in the social environmental crisis, then I better start thinking about how I could use my academic practice. So since then, I've done more work in this area. But what I've come to realize only since the last few years or so, that my academic role seems to be to annotate in ever greater detail our slide into chaos, and that obviously what I'm doing as an academic isn't really having sufficient impact, and maybe what academia itself isn't really having sufficient impact. So what did I do? Well, I write for the press, initially science journalism, written a book about climate change, I've given many talks, public lectures, supported campaigns, initiatives, some of it tried to promote particular kind of legislation. And let's be honest, I've got no idea what I am doing. It's a very kind of scattergun approach. Also, I need to acknowledge that that is not my day job. All these things have kind of been in addition to my research and teaching and climbing up that slippery pole of academic advancement. And somehow it feels like I'm almost trying to get away with it. I do keep it under the radar because it's not going to enhance my career. And in some instances, the university would be somewhat nervous, a bit uncomfortable with some of the things I've been trying to do in order to progress, let's say, sustainability, however you want to formulate it. And whilst I've been doing this, I've been watching, certainly over the last few years, I've been watching my academic colleagues, some of whom are my friends. I've been watching students, some of whom are my own students, protest, get arrested, and then end up being prosecuted and having a criminal record for making what they think can be their positive contribution. And I suppose the way I put it, there must be something between writing papers and getting carried away by the police. So this is why I've become really excited about potential working with Wolfgang, Jordan, Alison, and the rest of the faculty for a future team, because I do believe, I passionately believe, that there is a tremendous latent opportunity and transformative power in academia. Because if academia is not generating the new knowledge, not just in terms of solution or incremental responses to this crisis, but new ways of thinking, new ways of reimagining our relationship with the Earth system that we must live in, then what is academia for? I think there's been a building sense of frustration with many academics around the world and many people outside of academia who've been looking to academics as those vital truth tellers, as those people who will be unencumbered by commercial constraints to tell the truth. And perhaps in some instances we haven't, and we have been failing. But I do think we can make that positive contribution. And one way I think we can do that is through Faculty for the Future.
We have a question from Colin Summerhays for you, James. Isn't it the case that academics are only rewarded for publication and not for communication? And can we get this to change?
Yes, I think there is tremendous incentives to perform academically. It wasn't so long ago that I went through promotion. I've gone through promotion a couple of times now, and there's a little, it's all very clear. There's a little matrix and you have to tick the boxes. And of course, an important box you need to tick are publications. Why in the UK? And this differs around the world, but let's say in the UK, it's because of the ref, because of the way in which universities are assessed. One of the ways, and one of the ways that is in terms of the research outputs, which is the research papers. So as a faculty member, I need to make a good contribution, a 4-star contribution. I need to be producing papers which are getting into the top flight journals. And that's almost a direct measure of my academic worth. And if I don't do that, if I don't invest the time on writing the papers which get published in the right journals, then I'm not going to progress my career. My problem has been, and it is my problem has been that I kind of lost faith with some of that. Although I was quite motivated to write some papers, that represents a significant fraction of my, intellectual ability, which is quite limited. What can I do? What kind of contributions can I have? And yes, I could write these papers, but I just don't believe in many of these papers. I could write them, and I think I might be able to get them into some decent journals. what are they going to do? Obviously, in terms of my career enhancements, it's important, and I still have to do it if I want to continue to be an academic. But in terms of the value that is supplying to wider society, I think in many instances, it can be very limited.
We have another question come in. So recently you and Wolfgang and Bob Watson wrote an article on net zero, which went viral, which is amazing. Could you say something about that piece? Because in it you mentioned academia's responsibility to reflect on its purpose. And there was a lot of reaction on Twitter, but what was the reaction to that particular point in your paper, if anything?
So which particular point? Sorry,
So the point about academia's responsibility to reflect on its purpose.
Oh yeah, that was really interesting. That generated some really interesting discussions, because one of the ideas we're trying to articulate in that paper, and certainly what I've been trying to articulate since, is that academia's role in the climate crisis, or the climate and ecological crisis, is much broader than supplying policymakers with, let's say, policy relevant information or integrated assessment models. That's one thing that we can do. I think one of the problems that we have had or experiencing is that if you only have a hammer, the world is full of nails, right? If you're really good at generating quite complex models and scenarios, then that's what you're going to apply to the climate and ecological crisis. And that's good, that's important, but it's not the total contribution that academia can have. We need to be thinking about the modes of living, the worldviews, the value systems that underlie our particular forms of consumption or production. And what's been very interesting since publication is that many of the arguments we made at the time, and many of the arguments that I've made since, are not novel at all. It's been quite embarrassing when you discover there have been people who've been saying almost exactly the same things, much better articulated, for years previously, but they've never been listened to, or they never had that platform. And that's been really interesting. Why did that particular article cut through in certain ways, whereas there's been a significant body of literature, most of it, I think, from the social sciences, which is still, whilst might be important academically, it gets good citations, these are high quality pieces of work, hasn't managed to cut through into the wider public consciousness in the way that did. And my suspicion is because the kind of narratives which get generated in that more, let's say, social science domain is not very conducive to continuing the modes of consumption, modes of production that we have. In some instances, it might not be considered to be policy relevant. It's a bit difficult to deal with. It doesn't go along with a kind of the dominant narrative of how we're going to solve the climate ecological crisis, which is essentially through innovation and being cleverer. Right? It actually challenges us in a very fundamental way to rethink some of our relationships with the Earth system processes that everybody agrees we all ultimately depend on. No one disputes that. I think there's some really interesting work that we should engage with much more, because we might, through that, actually find some of the solutions that we're desperately looking for.
I wonder how many people realise that zero carbon, or the idea that we can stabilise the climate at somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees C, will still keep heating the planet, melting ice and raising sea level. We are losing Earth's refrigerator, which is the albedo from ice that is now disappearing. Less reflection of energy to space means more trapped in the environment. Do politicians realise this?
Well, no. Most politicians don't really have a very good understanding of the climate science. In many countries, most politicians now, I think, they're at least signed up to the idea of net zero. They're at least signed up to the idea that we have to stop greenhouse gas emissions, and until we stop greenhouse gas emissions, warming will continue to increase. So I think they get that. Of course, then the challenge is, well, what does that mean in practice? Because at the moment, net zero is increasingly relying on future carbon removals rather than rapid decarbonisation now, for various reasons that I think I might have gone into in some depth in the past. It really does matter, the scientific understanding of the climate and ecological crisis. There is increasing understanding of the climate aspect. There's practically none of the ecological crisis. When you have to explain to politicians why is biodiversity important, what is a biogeochemical process or a cycle, how the Earth system acts as a system and how that system will affect human systems, there's practically zero understanding of that in, let's say, the broader political community, I would argue.
So the question to you, James, is what do you think about academics using their human capital to join, give credibility and authority to civil disobedience movements? So, for example, leadership demonstrated recently by Peter Kalmus, the climate scientist who joined Scientist Rebellion.
One thing that academics, I think, sometimes don't appreciate is how trusted they are, how respected they are in society. Sometimes it feels you might be at the bottom of the heap given your working conditions and your pay. But and this is a robust result, I think, that probably crosses across many different countries. When you ask which are the trusted professions, which professions would you actually listen to and take heed of their advice and perhaps even warnings, academics are pretty much up there. Now that is largely based on their perceived objectivity. They're not corrupted by politics and influence. And I do appreciate that some academics are very, very nervous about crossing the line, stepping over the line between what you consider to be their academic conduct and taking a much more overt stance on social political issues, and maybe supporting, for example, non-violent direct action, or maybe even supporting a particular kind of a social campaign, or maybe even a political campaign, smaller case P, non-party political. But it's really important that we are honest with ourselves and with our wider community. I don't want to turn this into a very long answer, but one of the things that I think we really do need to address is when we're looking at the scenarios, potential scenarios, for, let's say, the climate crisis. I find it very, very hard to find anyone who thinks we'll stabilize temperatures at, let's say, 1.5 degrees Celsius, but there is a continuing use of academic output to support these very, very don't worry, steady she goes, incremental kind of policy approaches, which I think many people know is not going to work. Now, somehow we need to be honest with wider society about our internal fears and concerns. And maybe in some instances that does mean stepping over the line and doing things that perhaps previously we were not very comfortable with.
Indeed. And as we see, people are increasingly doing this. Another question's coming for you, James. This is from Peter Knapp. Should we think more carefully about how to encourage young people to go to university? And obviously, they should still be given choices, but he's concerned that many young people think that university will give them opportunities. He's not sure that this is true in most cases as we head towards very unstable times. Might the enormous debt that they will incur if they're studying in the UK and England be more of a barrier than the meagre opportunities ahead?
Oh, this is something that I really struggle with. So I've taught on undergraduate programs. I've designed and I lead postgraduate programs, and I do struggle with the financial commitment that represents students. It's a lot of money in the UK context. We are charging, and it's not a loan actually, it's a form of tax and how it gets repaid. So we are burdening young people with a significant financial liability on the basis of what? What is a university education for? I think as Laurie began to outline, some of the things we need to grapple with is whether or not our educational offerings at university are really fit for purpose. Many subjects are taught in the same way that they have been taught for decades. I shan't name any. You might have a suspicion of which kind of subjects I might be alluding to. The world is different, and the world is going to become increasingly different. Even, let's say we do it, right? Let's say we really undertake a sustainability transformation over the lifetime of our students, the young people that we have the privilege to teach. That means the world will be very, very different. The jobs that they do will be very different. The relationship with the earth system, maybe even the structuring of our societies and economies, will be very different. Now, that's the kind of change we want to see. Of course, if we don't do it, if they don't do it, if they don't manage that sustainable transition well, effectively, maybe even at all, then the world will also be very different, but in a very, very, very darker way. So either way, we need to, I think in many instances, repurpose education. And if you're going to talk about the UK context, I think there needs to be revisiting what the contract is between higher education and society. What are the goods and services? What are the value of higher education in the UK and wider? At the moment, it's still far too transactional. You go to university because it's going to pay off in terms of your salary. Universities generate knowledge, which can then increase the size of let's say, the global economy or the country economy. These are the things that we really do need to revisit.
Thank you. We have one final question for you, James. This is from Samuel Finnerty, who asked, do you have any tips for those finishing PhDs, he's studying social psychology, and how they might do this interdisciplinary work that intersects with communities facing these challenges? And he asked where you think he should direct his energy after his PhD.
Well, don't ask me about funding, because I must have one of the worst track records of, I wouldn't say any academic. I've been stubborn in persisting with grant applications that really do take serious the call for interdisciplinarity. And often when you do that, you realize they didn't want that at all. They wanted really quite narrowly defined, academically excellent kind of proposals, which further our knowledge. You know, scientists know more and more about less and less, and to the point where they know everything about nothing. I think there are, and one of the things we want to do in Faculty for a Future actually is produce maybe a database, increase awareness, and sometimes actually cultivate a much richer seam of funding for researchers, and in particular early career researchers. And that means going outside of the traditional funding bodies, these kind of calls which are insanely competitive, and identify new funders that want to take a risk. I mean, I think it's great that our project has been funded by a funder that realizes this is a bit of a risk, it's exploratory, but if we don't do this kind of research, we don't fund these kind of initiatives, then I don't think we're going to have any chance of undertaking the transformations that we need in the timescales that we need them. So in terms of advice, this sounds really cheesy. I don't mean it like this, but like, stay tuned, keep in touch. And this is one of the areas that we do want to develop.
For some years, I was a career academic. I made a decision to go down the academic management route, and I developed a very successful psychology program. And off the back of that success, I then was put in charge of the entire social sciences curriculum portfolio, and then progressed to become dean, and then landed what I thought was my absolute dream job, and I became pro-vice chancellor at a private university, and was managing, literally running the university. And it was a job I thought I really wanted. And just as that happened, when I thought I had it made, I started reading. A friend showed me some articles about the climate crisis and said, what do you think? And I started reading some articles, and I read the IPCC 1.5 report, as many of us did. And I was absolutely horrified. I was terrified. And what I couldn't reconcile for myself was, why is it that in my position as dean and running a university, and talking on a daily basis with colleagues who were environmental scientists and geographers and earth scientists, why was nobody talking about this? So I thought, well, I'll talk about it. And so I rather naively started taking some papers to work, and I put them around our executive team, and I said, shouldn't we be talking about this? Does this not make everything else on our agenda completely irrelevant and redundant? And I got a few sort of surprised looks and a bit of shuffling feet and a little bit of embarrassment, actually, some embarrassed responses. And then I got I was given some time to talk and say my piece, and then it was, well, let's get back to the agenda. And I was torn. I was very, very conflicted. And so my reality, which had been one of KPIs, of market research, and of looking at things like student progression and retention and performance and so forth, and all of that stood in sort of stark contrast to the world in which I was starting to align myself, which was the world of activism and a world of actually trying to do something about all of this. And people respond in different ways to their growing understanding of what's actually happening. My reaction to the situation was one in which I was enabled to use my privilege, and I decided that for me personally, the only thing I felt I could reasonably do was actually just quit academia. So I resigned from my post, and it's a decision I haven't once regretted, and I decided to devote my life, what's left of it, to advocacy and activism. And I'm doing that in large part because I have 4 children. I have 4 children, and it really pains me to see my young people, as they are now, attending university and at times talking about a future that I don't believe is going to be available to them. And it's something I personally find extremely painful. Now, James and Laurie have talked about the the perfect storm that lies ahead and about the precarious future into which we are hurtling and the burden that this is going to place on young people. They've talked about the accelerating destabilization that will make it even harder for us to adapt and what this will mean for what we teach and research now and in the future. And my conclusion, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that academia is not fit for future purpose and that there's this enormous mismatch between the potential for good and the responses to the crisis. The universities have enormous potential. They have a capacity and a responsibility to seek and enact change in society. But this capacity is presently not realised, and this is a profound disappointment for me. So many have acknowledged the threat of the climate emergency and the leading role that they must take to producing positive change. So, for example, here in the UK, the Climate Commission for Higher and Further Education was set up in 2019. But we're in 2022 now, and what's actually changed? So given that universities recognise their broad and outward-facing social role, much of their proposed actions are really very insular and very disappointing, and focusing on individualistic and narrow carbon accounting to achieve net zero by a particular date, rather than their potential for contributing to transformative change across society. Worse, the integrity of institutions has been compromised by the infiltration of fossil fuel interests, and interests that play out in myriad ways and discussed by academics such as Ben Franta in the US. So from pandering to fossil fuel interests around curriculum, for example, by irresponsibly proclaiming until very recently that there's never been a better time to be a petroleum engineer, to allowing fossil fuel interests to influence staff appointments and student career choices. It's an unbelievably hypocritical position. For me, the good news is that academics are increasingly alert to this. So, for example, Bruce Glavovich, Ian White and Tim Smith recently wrote about the tragedy of climate science and controversially called for a moratorium on research where the science is settled. And they recognised that they just couldn't keep going on churning out another IPCC report documenting the ever-worsening situation we face. And I think what was interesting about that article was that it divided academics. It divided them, but it stimulated a conversation about what it is we could actually do. And so that conversation has been picked up by other researchers such as Esther Turnhout and Mariana Larson. And they argue that, yes, they agree with much of what has been said by Bruce and co, but they argue that what we actually need to have is a conversation around the science-society contract. And this requires a fundamental rethinking of what is the science-society contract, and an acknowledgement that it's not simply a linear process where the scientists call for something and then policymakers then enact that and act upon that call. So what is needed then is a recognition that these intimate interactions between sciences and society are very complicated, and that there's an impossibility of escaping politics. And so this calls into question the independence and the neutrality of academia. But what's important, I think, is that these academics are starting to say, we need to talk. So in recognising and acknowledging the social dimensions of the crisis, we also need to acknowledge the key role that social sciences, humanities, and arguably all disciplines can play here. So the climate and ecological crisis is not simply the domain of climate scientists, conservationists, and ecologists. It's about all of us, and we each have a part to play. Some questions that we're looking at in Faculty for a Future are things like, well, can academia help to co-create a better, safer, and fairer future? And we certainly need a much richer set of social imaginaries that are free from assumptions and built-in constraints about how humanity might live. And this will require transdisciplinary perspectives. And this flies in the face, of course, of the way in which academia is constructed, because academia is very much a sort of siloed industry, for want of a better term, where people inhabit their disciplinary groupings. And it's actually really quite hard, in my experience and in many others, to foster that kind of transdisciplinary thinking and that kind of collaborative working. Of course, the marketisation of HE has skewed curriculum portfolios very much towards courses that are financially sustainable, or that confer graduate premium, or that otherwise perform well against a set of KPIs that actually serve economics and serve the economic system, as opposed to serving the needs of humanity and how we can all live well on a planet of finite resources. So the question arises then about, well, what is the role of academia at this point in time when we are facing an existential crisis? I was astonished a few years ago when when I attended a meeting in London, which was attended by a number of pro-vice chancellors and vice chancellors, and one of the agenda items was actually terrifying. It was about the existential crisis that we face, and I was flummoxed and absolutely profoundly shocked that at the end of a presentation from a consultant who talked about the threat that we face, that humanity faces, not a single person asked a question. And I don't believe it's because they were shocked. I think it was simply that they couldn't process the information, and it was embarrassing. I looked around me and I could see embarrassed responses. So it's difficult. It's very hard to think about the existential crisis and to talk about it, because how do we talk about these things? Some academics are beginning those conversations. So, for example, people like Aaron Thierry, Julia Steenberger, Charlie Gardner, and William Rowlandson have called for a shift from publications to public actions. And they're calling for academics to openly embrace advocacy and activism as their duty at this time. But for some, it's a step too far. And the threat, and of course, as James has said, somewhere in between that point of doing your day job and getting arrested and spending a night in a cell. There's probably a set of action. There are probably a series of things that the academic community can actually do. One thing that I think is clear, though, is that we can't simply continue to talk about our research as if we don't actually believe it. So talking about the crisis and describing in ever more alarming detail our descent into a disaster merely serves to reinforce a sense that we, the grown-ups in the room, are not doing enough. And it's a betrayal. It's a betrayal of young people that really must stop. And it's something that we must reflect on. So one question I'm seeing here is, are we being too hard? Am I being too hard on the academics, in that universities have globally made net zero pledges and they're working towards them? So is it fair to say that they are making things worse? I suppose what I'm doing is trying to highlight and underscore the responsibility that academics and academic institutions have, because just as they have a capacity to act and a capacity to do good, then with that capacity arguably comes an obligation to actually do something about the inequalities and also to do something about climate justice, to respond to calls for climate justice. So in a sense, I would say that it is incumbent on institutions to do more. Are they making things worse? It's a difficult one. I mean, institutions, by being complacent and by not calling out, and by, as we've seen with the ongoing acceptance of research funds from fossil fuel organisations, this is clearly not going to make things better. But what it does do is sort of normalises the ongoing acceptance and the legitimises fossil fuel interests, which is actually seriously detrimental at a point when we really absolutely have to stop doing this. I'm going to move on to another question here. It's rather tricky having to chair myself. There's a question here about how is Faculty for a Future going to crack the ivory tower mentality of academics towards true collaborative research. And I think this speaks to the problem of the silos, academic silos. Most institutions are organised around clear disciplinary groups. So it would be a school of psychology, for example, or a faculty of this, or an institute of that. There are examples of transdisciplinary initiatives and people trying to work across disciplines. The problem is that academics themselves are primarily directed, and it's extremely difficult for them to try and work across those disciplinary boundaries because there are enormous barriers, systemic. There are processes and structures in place that actually just make it unbelievably hard for them to do that. You'll be pleased to know that one of the things that Jordan will be talking about later on in this session will be some of the ideas that we've had around how we can start to address those barriers and what you can do within your institutions, within your departments, within your schools to try to explore what those barriers, acknowledge that they exist, and then think about, well, what can we actually do about these barriers?
I'm hopefully going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour here, just to say that this will just be a surface overview. We've got hub-specific launches planned for the coming weeks, and you can sign up to those on our website. But yeah, I'll be giving just a whistle-stop tour today. And first of all, just to say right from the off, that there's hopefully, I think you'll find that there's something for everyone, whether you're an early career researcher or a professor from France or Bangladesh, whether you want to get deeply involved or only have half an hour. And we also have plenty of opportunities to get involved if you're not directly yourself an academic. There are opportunities for academic related staff, for students, for local Indigenous community representatives and other non-academic voices. And for all of this work, we're really wanting to advance this in collaboration with you. We've got clear proposals for moving forward, but whatever your place in and around the academic sphere, there are plenty of opportunities to shape the form and direction of these plans on the website. So, and of course, Pauline, feel free to bring us ideas as well, and that applies to everybody else watching. So as I say, plenty more in these upcoming hub-specific launches, but just a quick rundown now of our work across these three core areas of academic life: teaching, research, and engagement. And I want to start with the area in which I nearly fell through the cracks, which is teaching. Knowing what I know now about how all-encompassing this social environmental crisis is, it seems like madness to me that as a psychology undergraduate, I got absolutely no crisis relevant education whatsoever. I've seen a couple of psychologists in the chat. I'd love to know what they think about that. I left my undergrad without anything more than a cursory awareness that there were environmental problems that others were sorting out. And luckily, I found another route into the space, but many others don't. And there is, I think, increasing recognition that the all-encompassing crises that we're facing need to be brought to every student on campus. There are plenty of universities that have expressed commitments to education sustainable development. Seeing a question in the chat about that, I personally think that we need to go further than that, but perhaps that's something for the teaching launch. But I think also it's important to recognize that there are lots of academics, regardless of these institutional commitments, that want to transform their own teaching to better equip students for the world ahead. And a lot of them have agency to change their teaching. But what they're lacking, I think, is the time to really engage with how they can contribute and find resources they can trust, especially if they're from a discipline that seems at first glance more distant from social environmental crisis. So what we're doing is developing a repository that contains open access teaching resources from a range of disciplines to help you adapt existing material or adopt new teaching material. And the quality of this material will be assured by academics with experience of curriculum design as well as students. So we're making sure that it's serving students and also can be implemented. Alongside that, we're developing support to help you contextualize your piece of the teaching puzzle within the big picture, and to help your student think in terms of their contribution to the discipline spanning issues that define our future. And alongside that as well, support to foster the emotional coping skills and the agency that make what is otherwise an incredibly daunting road ahead, and I really feel that sometimes, into something that can be held healthily. So that's teaching. As for research, I think we've seen in the chat so far that there's an increasingly widespread desire to focus more on unlocking a real world emergency response to the crisis that we face. And with such crucial decisions in our near future, more and more people and more academics are really feeling that responsibility to shape this response equitably with underrepresented academic and local and practical knowledge. So hopefully, seeing your question, Manda, asking about how we can enable this kind of two-way osmosis, our plan here is to grow a digital grassroots network with the aim of fostering grant proposals that are co-created between academics with a pre-existing platform and underrepresented academic and local knowledge holders, especially those from areas that are already experiencing the effects of interlocking crises, and also particularly those who have limited access to research funding. You know, we're very aware that the access to research funding is dramatically skewed towards high-income countries. And so we want this network to be facilitated by a repository of funders who really genuinely do support the kind of co-creation that we need rather than just say they do. And alongside that, guidance that helps to ensure equitable collaboration among what will be quite a diverse set of stakeholders. And we're under no illusions that this is an absolutely massive challenge. And we're going to be putting a lot of time and effort into making sure that we can develop these kinds of processes. And if you have any expertise or input and thoughts on that, then please go to our website and make yourself known, because we really want to get this right. And we certainly don't have all the answers yet. Now, one really important thing to mention about this research network, or what unites it, is a focus on really unlocking real world transformation that serves communities and society. And a big part of that is understanding how research gets used or not used by others. I think probably everybody here shares this same sense that we're not in the situation that we're in because of an information deficit. And so we really need our research to understand how power actually works and how the systemic transformations that the UN are calling for can actually be realized. So that's the network. And alongside that, we want to provide some inspiration with stories that can inspire us along the path of emergency research response. And one of the things that's closest to my heart is to provide a space for non-academic communities to express real life harms that have been done by particular research practices and how they would like to see research serve their needs and perspectives. And on the other side of that coin as well, stories of co-produced, equitable, action-focused research at its best. I've seen a couple of things in the chat asking about examples to inspire best practice, and I think we'll try and share a couple that we've come across already in the main Q&A section, but we want to be putting a lot more out there because it's really that inspiration that can help us move forward together. And finally, one part of that set of stories is we want to highlight academics who have perhaps not been studying or studying an aspect of research that could be relevant to social environmental crisis, but they haven't been directly applying it, or maybe they're studying something completely different and they want to reorient their research. There are plenty of academics out there. Peter Kalmus is an example, who have found ways to reorient their research towards the planetary predicament that we're in. And we really want to highlight them. So whether you're somebody that has gone through that journey and wants to share their story, or you're an academic that wants to go on that same journey, then please check out the research page on our website, and we'll be looking to provide support to help you take those steps. On to the third pillar, engagement. So again, I'm sure perhaps we're all feeling a sense of worry at the limited range of expertise that's platformed in media environments. You know, a crisis seen largely as a technical crisis of emissions reduction and energy transition, not considering the wider picture of not only our erosion of the natural world, but also the human systems that are underlying all of this degradation. But what's happening as a result of that is an undue burden on natural scientists to be carrying the entire weight of the crisis alone. So what we're doing right now is producing a toolkit that's derived from the latest communications research that outlines techniques that academics can use to broaden consciousness of interlocking crises from their own disciplinary perspective, so without compromising their professional credibility. We're seeing a particular onus here, an opportunity here for natural scientists to use their platform to open the space for others, but it will be relevant for all. And added onto this toolkit, we will be running media training and assistance with media placement where possible. And I just really want to emphasize that we're looking in part here to unearth a new generation of scientific communicators who really can and feel passionate about broadening public consciousness of interlocking crisis. And just to come back to that issue of inspiration here, it's an incredibly complex story that needs to be told. We're under no illusions, and the research out there says that one of the best ways to help communicate that complexity is through real life examples. So if you have any examples of human decision making resulting in resilience and avoided harm amid interlocking crises, then please let us know on the website, on the engagement page. So I just want to mention two more things quickly before we move to the Q&As. We know that institutions play a big role in the direction of teaching and research at a systemic level. We've seen that through a couple of comments in the chat. And lots of people are already engaging their institutions to take up a true leadership position. but they're not as well connected or supported as they could be. So what we want to do is to support those who are already playing or want to play an active role in scaling the transformation of teaching and research towards realizing a better future. And what this means in practice is an open source toolkit with effective engagement strategies from the collective intelligence of those who are already having successes across the world. And alongside that, the opportunity to be placed into communities with others going through the same challenges, to share experiences and successes and to support each other. And then finally, last but not least, we're also providing opportunity for academics to connect with peers. We know from the people that are here today are representing, I think, a wider feeling of increasing disconnect between their typical institutional role and the urgency of the colliding crises that we face. And so in partnership with the Climate Psychology Alliance, we're hosting workshops that will offer a reflective space for academics to share their perspectives on this tension with each other and explore how to move forward while maintaining professional credibility. Okay, so that's plenty from me. Let's go to some questions. Alison, what's first up?
I'm going to put Wolfgang on the spot first, if I may. So one of the roots of this problem is the Western worldview of dominance and control over the environment, over other people, and so forth. There is also a question here of epistemic justice. As academics, we have epistemic authority, but we are also at the vanguard of this cultural worldview. The scientific method in many ways is a condensation of the Western worldview. So how does academia become part of the solution? This seems to me to be only plausible through the process called decolonialization. The change in worldview has to happen before we can do useful kinds of science. But if decolonialization is a process, oops, sorry, question has just skipped away, is a process of relinquishing that kind of control, how do you find a way to do it without control just being held by those who aren't on the same page? That's a very long question. Are you okay to start with that one, Wolfgang?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alison, and thank you very much, Erica, for posting this really, really important question here. We have in the team grappled a lot with the notion of decolonization. That is true. For me, that's very much a question of, you know, where do you actually start? Where does the colonization start? And I think the first step in that direction is to start with yourself and with the environment around you. And one thing I'm really grappling with and have been grappling with a lot of time is the question of what we don't know. And I totally agree with this notion that the way academic works is a condensation of sort of Western culture and Western thinking. But I really think that we have to start personally. And what I always find is the problem with not facing the crisis as it is kind of boils down to a problem of cleverness versus wisdom, and a problem about how to deal with what we don't know. And what I can see in the media a lot of times is concentrating on what we know. And it all sounds like what the IPCC does, in fact, is it does project certain ideas into the future. It talks about what will happen by 2100, by 2050, and net zero by 2050, all these narratives about the future. But in fact, my feeling about this is that we know a lot less than this is admitted. And we academics are extremely bad at treating what we don't know. And I think, to me, that's really the starting point. And the starting point there is also to see that when you look at non-academics, even just average people on the street, you know, you would meet randomly, I think they often have a better grasp of the severity of the crisis, because they're not trained to always have to look clever. And for me, that's really the starting point. And one thing we want to do in Faculty Future around this is to bring in non-academics. So these could be local communities affected by any kind of aspect of the crisis. It could be, you know, it could be biodiversity decline, climate change. It could be anything. It will also be affected by the way we treat the crisis. They could be affected by, for example, carbon projects, could be affected by other net zero policies or that. So basically, we have to broaden the narrative. We have to basically open up ourselves to other points of view, and we're not very good at that as academics. I think that we have to admit that. And these are all steps towards getting out of that dominant narrative, so decolonizing ourselves. And well, and then my last remark is about I do think that academics have immense narrative power, you know, about the problem of that not being taken up, but also we're under immense control, and that's and for that reason, I find it if we start on that path and we really genuinely decolonize ourselves, then that would trickle down.
Thanks, Wolfgang. It's so true that in academia we reify knowledge, but we reify certain forms of knowledge, and we undervalue Indigenous knowledge and other ways of knowing. So it's such an important point that we all need to really reflect on. Going to the next question now, and this is from John Owens, and it's a question for Jordan. How do we change the narrative in academic institutions and in policy world in the context of a hegemonic neoliberalism which constrains the way in which action and leadership towards the environmental crises is conceived and enacted? Universities and politicians are more interested in shallow engagement and reassurance strategies than meaningful change. Jordan.
Wow. Well, that's a big question, isn't it? And I guess there's lots of things to say on this point. I think perhaps the first thing to say is that I don't think everybody is the same out there, of course not, and I doubt you do either, John. I just want to give a shout out to those that are taking some bold steps. One particular story that I came across was University of Minnesota, who have basically integrated what's called a Reality 101 mini course as part of compulsory education for all undergraduates at the start of their undergraduate experience, which really takes you through the entirety of these interlocking crises that we're facing: the climate, nature, social causes and consequences. And of course, you know, there are also plenty out there who are not willing to take a leadership role, some of them willfully ignorant. And I think maybe quite a few who are approaching, as much of society does now, their operations and their business from a risk management perspective, and they're not wanting to take the leaps. And that's why really we focused on Faculty for a Future on what academics can do now without relying on senior management. And I think there's a really interesting pathway to systemic transformation here, because I think we're all maybe agreed here that, okay, sure, there are some sacrifices that might need to be made in transitioning teaching, research, etc. There are also huge benefits to institutions for taking leadership positions, and of course risks, as Laurie spoke about, in not doing that. And once senior leadership can see academics in their institutions exercising agency to deliver the kind of teaching and research that students want and that society really value, the smart institutions, the smart senior management individuals will institutionalize what these academics are doing, and the others will become obsolete. I do also want to emphasize that we don't want to shy away from directly engaging senior management, and that's where our institutional engagement work comes in. There does need to be organized action to accelerate systemic transformations within universities, and there are effective ways of doing that. I've seen plenty of inspirational examples already, and I hope that we'll be able to share them with you through our institutional engagement work in due course. And I think then maybe the final point that I want to mention here is that, quite frankly, not enough people are quote unquote there yet, really, in terms of feeling the urgency of interlocking crisis. So a really crucial point for us is providing opportunities for as many people to get on the conveyor belt of action as possible. If you look at neuroscience research, there's plenty that suggests that a key factor in actually allowing beliefs to change is fostering agency in the first place, which then opens up the path to further systemic transformation. So what we really want Faculty for a Future to be is a place where we can bring community together around achievable actions and using that as a springboard to decide together where we go next.
Thanks, Jordan. Okay, another question now, which I'm going to put to James. This is a question from Alison Crowther. Government policy and business policy is a powerful way to enact change. However, they are elected by the public. How can we change academia to work directly for and with publics and the so far seemingly forgotten massive raft of micro and small businesses in Western countries, at least? I and others work in deliberative democracy constantly shows that direct contact with academics and scientists affects people deeply, and they make changes in their lives after such interventions.
That's a great question. Democracy is a really good idea. We should try it sometime. Yeah, I mean, we have a particular form of democracy, representative democracy. And in academia, often the pathways to impacting, let's say, politics or policy is really quite narrow. There's a lot of focus on the things that happen in the UK, in Westminster, in national government, the kind of impact stories you are incentivized to want to construct. You want to demonstrate how your research or academic practice has transformative impacts. Then you're often rooted towards national government, because that's where the greatest impact is. I have done some work with deliberative democracies, like citizens' assemblies, some of them quite small and informal, some of them a bit larger, and they really have been transformative experiences, well, certainly for me and some of the people that were participating in them. I've been very interested in the role, the potential for academia to help facilitate some of that. And some of it seems quite mundane. It's been a number of years ago I now realized that an academic institution can have a transformative impact, because there are community groups, there are individuals who've been struggling with particular issues, whether it's decarbonisation, air pollution, dietary change, active transport and planning, whatever it is. And a very small amount of universities' finance, or a very small amount of the university facilities, offering up a space in which you can have a community use the academic space and can be facilitated and supported by academics, where they can get that direct relationship, they can get that kind of direct exchange from academics and speaking directly to the people or peoples concerned, can really have a transformative impact. And that's just one way that universities as institutions can play a much more active role as a good member of society, as a responsible kind of citizen. Many universities, certainly here at the University of Exeter, are very keen at talking about making global citizens of our students. There are some things that we want our students to understand about the climate and ecological crisis. Some of that is kind of compulsory, or it's increasingly becoming compulsory. But the overall objective is to make them responsible global citizens. Well, I think many institutions and academia itself could do a much, much better job at being a responsible global citizen. And part of that means talking directly with citizens, either through citizens' assemblies, climate assemblies, or other forms of democratic models. It's not just about rooting us to some sort of half-day event in Westminster where we might be able to influence some politicians. Yes, that's important. There is a very, very broad spectrum of things that we can do as academics that really could unlock transformative change.
Excellent. Thank you, James. Another question's come in. This is from Georgina Triola, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who asks, is there more room in academic institutions for natural science and social sciences faculties to work together? For example, developing and offering crossover undergraduate and postgraduate teaching modules that cover social and natural science topics surrounding the climate and ecological crisis. That is one I have direct experience of myself, and it's interesting. So my quick answer to that question is there certainly should be more room for that. The reality in academic institutions, certainly the ones that I have experience of, is that it's very hard to make those things come about. And one of the reasons, well, there are a number of reasons why it's difficult to make that come about. And I will say a little bit about that, but my point is not to say that just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't try it. We absolutely should be doing this. one of the things that's super important that we should do is move beyond these disciplinary silos, because if we don't look beyond our disciplines, minus psychology, for example, for us it might be geography, then we're only going to get a tiny view or lens on the overall problem. So the way that HE is constituted in the UK is it's very, very tightly regulated. So we have agencies that regulate and sort of reference the kinds of things that the curriculum absolutely must cover. So for an academic, your job then is to look at the regulatory framework, certainly within the UK, and then to put together a programme or a course that ticks all those boxes and does all those things that the Quality Assurance Agency, for example, or the government say that it must actually do. And it gives academics not a great deal of wriggle room to then actually try and cover the bigger issues and those bigger pictures and those transdisciplinary kinds of issues and questions that need to be taught. Another issue, I think, for academia and for academics is that we are inherently tribal. And that tribalism plays out in really unfortunate ways, some of which I have direct experience of. And it kind of reduces our capacity to work in a much more collaborative kind of way and to look at things in a much more collaborative way. So I think that there are a number of big questions here for academics about moving beyond tribalism and moving beyond our disciplinary silos and starting to look at the bigger picture. So yes, I think there should certainly be more space for this. And that conversation needs to start, and it needs to be driven in a number of different ways. So it can be driven, for example, by young students in campaigns such as Teach the Future and Fridays for Future, and young people saying, we need to be taught these sorts of things. And it can be driven by people like Laurie, for example, and his Cohort 2040, and looking into the future, what it is that the young people of today need for the future. And those kinds of things can then be indicators and can drive changes that we currently need. And of course, the key factor in all of this too are those who are, I call them the sort of the hidden enemy in a sense. It's those people who are leading academic institutions and have thus far flown under the radar. They've escaped criticism, and what they are doing is perpetuating business as usual and pandering to the needs of governments and pandering to all sorts of pressures and the fossil fuel interests, because it's easy to take that route, and it's much harder to then actually stand and make a stand. And that's actually what we need to do. I'm going to move on now to another question. So this is a question for James, I think. And the question comes from Drew Pierce. It's interesting to hear talk about what sort of concepts and language that can't or don't make it into scientific journals. Do we need academic publishing with different priorities, or do we need to reassess publication as a measure of academic success? Is the drive to be novel problematic?
Okay. Yes, certainly the drive to be novel is problematic. And before I answer that question, I can't not just chip in with some of my own personal experiences about trying to do interdisciplinary teaching for the last 10 years or so. Universities like to say they do it, and it's incredibly difficult to actually do it because of the siloed nature of academia, because there's disciplinary excellence. But of course, if you've got any interest in teaching the climate and ecological crisis, it spans pretty much all of human activity. So in many instances, I don't think our teaching is fit for purpose. And just to recognise the comment from Stuart about the increased centralisation, managerialism in not all universities across the world, but certainly Australia, United Kingdom, United States, other places, and increasing control of the centre. And I think in a very understandable way, disciplines have tried to resist that by becoming more, tried to maintain their autonomous nature. This is this discipline, this is that discipline. But what it actually does inadvertently kind of separates them from other disciplines, which they should be working together in a much more collegiate environment. So there's some really interesting dynamics there. In terms of publishing, I mean, look, we all know the publishing model is broken. It's a racket. It's a vast profit generating scheme for a very small number of academic journals that we still seem unable to break out of. I was part of the Elsevier and the kind of the Springer boycotts, and they kind of come and go. And there was an attempt, and now we just go back to it, right? We just get back to looking at impact factors and because we are directly incentivized to do that. If you want to progress your career in academia, you are still going to be largely based on your publication. It's easy for me, now that I'm relatively settled, to be quite relaxed about the journals I might want to publish in or the kind of work that I want to publish in. But if I'm working with my PhD student or my postdoctoral student who are in a fierce, brutal competition to get that next postdoc position, to get that faculty position, and being assessed within a field of abundant riches, wildly capable people with very, very impressive publication records, I cannot in all good faith say, no, you should sit that one out. Don't publish over there. Be principled about it. There's something very dysfunctional about the academic game and how academics are evaluated and assessed. And we need to acknowledge that that really does work in the favor of a small number of incredibly wealthy and powerful publishing entities. So I think if we could begin to address that, and there have been some interesting and hopeful tentative approaches into open accessing and different ways of sharing our science. But certainly we still have the situation where we've got leading research being firewalled, not being read by anyone outside of the academic community, when these are vital contributions to society that represents the goods, the goods and services that university produce should be made widely available. So there's much to talk about there, and maybe we might be able to make a bit of progress.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and I'm reminded of one paper which I think everyone should read, really, and it's the one about 3 decades of climate, of trying to bend the emissions curve, which is an awesome paper. And if people haven't read it, please do. I'm afraid I don't have the full list of authors here or the reference, but yeah, we can maybe put that out. Laurie, would you like to come in with any comments on that point about publications before I move over to Jordan for final words?
I don't think I've got anything necessary to add above what James said. I would just like to underline another theme that was discussed on how we shouldn't slip into the view that we just need to be closing the information deficit, as it were, when it comes to academia towards policymaking. There are a number of other deficits it's very important to close, including what I would call the salience deficit, to make sure that we're able to communicate some of these issues, particularly around risk, to audiences in a way that really connects with their existing risk currency, as it were. And then, of course, closing a power deficit, touching on some of the themes that people were suggesting, and building that academic power above and beyond just closing information or even salience deficits is absolutely crucial. And that's something I'm particularly welcome as a theme that people would explore through the faculty.
Super, thank you. Thanks, Laurie. This one is for James. And James, the question is, do you have any recommendations for how those of us in research areas with a little direct connection to climate, in my case, neuroscience, how they should think about their role, responsibility, and how to balance contribution to a movement with our day job in an unrelated field?
That is a good question. So maybe one piece of advice I could offer is that working with your community is a gateway drug. It's a way for you to understand what people outside of academia are concerned about with regards to the climate ecological crisis, the social environmental crisis. As academics, I think we've traditionally thought that our role is generating knowledge and then delivering that to society, throwing it over the wall and then saying, there you go, society, fix that. And really, you can call it bidirectional engagement. You might want to call it just listening to what people want from academia. What are the challenges that they face? What are their concerns? What are their fears? And you will find, given any university will typically be within a community, and there's often issues about town and gown, separating academics and academic institutions from their local communities, you will find that there are many, many people who have been struggling with these issues and their personal contributions for decades. Many of them feel quite alone, quite isolated. They have issues of maybe at times of not just fear, but despair. And what you can do as an academic is potentially transformative. I found it myself in that you can offer your time to support local initiatives. You can offer space on campus to facilitate local community meetings. You can work with colleagues in different departments who might be social scientists, might be human geographers, might be working with the local community in order to do data collection or some kind of project based in that community, and offer your support that way. I think we can have a whole spectrum of very positive contributions that go beyond our very narrow disciplinary excellence. And as you do that, you begin to discover that you can actually make some really useful contributions. You might have some skills in certain areas. You might have a network that these people or community organizations might want to use. You might know people, you might be able to introduce people, you might be able to facilitate. And along the way, you may discover that your actual teaching and research practice might become informed, and you can kind of begin to make collaborations, begin to offer your academic expertise to other academics working, let's say, more clearly defined within the social environmental crisis. I suppose the last thing I'll say about that question is that if you're serious about addressing the social environmental crisis, then we need to address everything. I mean, we are potentially going to transform most of society. So we've all got some role to play, right? There's always some kind of contribution that we make within our academic practice and certainly in a wider community context.
Thank you, James. The next question is for Wolfgang. Wolfgang, here's your question. This is from Stephen Mulkey, by the way. Thank you, Stephen. So Wolfgang, as president of Unity College in Maine, I led the effort for the first institution of higher education in the US to divest its endowment from the top 200 fossil fuel companies. Many public universities continue to hide their investments in these companies, and faculty often avoid speaking out about these issues because they are viewed as political. What is the role of faculty in the absolute demand that institutions must not invest in fossil fuels?
Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Steve, for this really important question. I'd actually think that, I mean, what you've done is really, really important and courageous. And I think we need to acknowledge that the funding of university research by fossil fuel interests, and not only by fossil fuel interests, but in any interest that is greatly invested in preserving the status quo, is a massive problem. And basically, I have to say that right now there are protests going on in both Oxford and Cambridge and about exactly that. And I've actually got an MPhil degree from Cambridge, and I'm actually so glad that this is taken up now by students. So oftentimes it's led by students, actually. Now, one thing that we want to do is basically platform people like yourself or other academics that we're talking to who are doing these kinds of courageous steps, so that basically we're creating this image that this is actually quite normal to stand up to these fossil fuel interests, for example. So one person we're talking to is Adam Aron, for example. He's from University of California, San Diego, and he's basically he's left his career in neuroscience, and now he's basically expressively doing research on the psychology of becoming an activist. And as part of that, he's actually addressed the entire fossil fuel and net zero issue of the University of California. And these kind of movements are terribly important, but so far they really happen in isolation. And the impact that could have if it's platformed more broadly and change, we can change the narrative and make it far more normal to stand up to that. Then hopefully in the near future, we all think, oh, 5 years back, we were still accepting fossil fuel money. I mean, how crazy. So that's really our goal. And yeah, and check out the different actions we've got. And we don't have all the answers, all these steps into that direction. I'm hopeful that we can really move on.
Excellent, thank you, Wolfgang. The next question is from Michael Rabeniak in Cambridge for Jordan. He says, I can't disagree with anything that's been posited so far by the speakers and applaud the initiative. And thank you for that. We appreciate that. But our universities are now set up expressly to create confirming neoliberal subjects concerned only with addressing the immediate present through a pedagogy of training and skills. How can this awareness of addressing a collective future possibly come to pass within the given model of the university, one that's circumscribed by market state ideology? He says, these are good words, but I don't see any trace of a dialectical stance here, at least yet. Jordan, challenging.
Wow. I mean, that's an incredibly tough question. And I think the answer will change depending on who you speak to. And I think that's probably part of the problem. But actually, you know, it's interesting thinking back to when we were starting out on our journey and thinking about how we were going to plan our work, and a lot of people just said, just don't bother engaging with senior management, you're barking up the wrong tree. And in many ways, I think that's part of why we're really focusing on what academics can do now without asking permission. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I do also want to be fair, I think, to the definitely minority of senior management professionals out there who are taking steps. I saw a couple of asks in the chat for inspirational examples. Well, one comes from University of Minnesota, where their dean decided to enlist one of their academics, Nate Hagens, to take his Reality 101 course, which is really an attempt at bringing a system synthesis approach to the crises that we're facing, to basically give a short version of that to all students at University of Minnesota as part of their compulsory experience as an undergraduate. They couldn't graduate without doing it. So essentially it was in effect for credit. Now, of course, well, I think the other thing as well to say is that, of course, there is nuance between different countries. I think the more education is marketized, the more this is an issue. You look at the difference in public funding in HE between the UK and France. I think it's like 7 times higher in France. But then again, you know, even in these countries where education is highly publicly funded, of course, there's nowhere near the kind of level of transformative action, particularly on education, that we need to see. And I think some of that is willful ignorance. I think also some of it is coming from what we see across all sectors of society, this risk management perspective, not wanting to take jumps. And I think that takes me back to, again, coming back to what academics can do now without relying on senior management, because there are actually big benefits to taking leadership positions, particularly on teaching, purely because this is what students want, right? This is time and time again, we're seeing students don't want fossil fuel funding in their institutions. They want to be getting an education that matters. And once academics in their institutions once senior management, in their institutions see academics exercising agency, and the incredibly positive response from students, and likewise, you know, the similar analog with research that really serves society, the smart ones will institutionalize what they're doing, and the others will become obsolete. I also want to mention just very quickly, I think this came in before I was speaking, but we don't want to shy away from directly engaging senior management at all. You know, there is a real need for organized action to accelerate change, and there are effective ways of doing that, and that's what we'll be pulling together with our institutional engagement toolkit. And Wolfgang mentioned Adam Aaron. I would also look out for work that he's doing to build that institutional engagement. Check him out, follow him on Twitter, and I'm sure there'll be updates coming soon. And then finally, just to round off, I think the other point here to mention is that, quite frankly, you know, if we talk about collective action and organization being really crucial here in bringing that systemic transformation, it just is a cold, hard fact that not enough people are, quote unquote, there yet in terms of feeling the urgency of interlocking crises. So a real crucial point, I think, is to be able to provide opportunities for as many people as possible to get onto that conveyor belt of action, and through action, then have the beliefs move along that chain, so that you've got a critical mass of people who are saying, right, let's really make some proper change here. And so in many ways, my biggest hope of Faculty for a Future is that what we're doing now is a springboard to decide together where to go next and really bring that systemic transition that we all want.
Excellent, thank you, Jordan. Yeah, and just to recap, just to repeat, you know, this is the start of the conversation. It's a conversation that's long overdue, and it's just fantastic for all of us that so many of you have joined us from all around the globe. We really, really appreciate it. And the next, we'll do a couple more questions. The next one is for James. Where do you think we need to consolidate our efforts with regards to education for sustainability? Is enough being done in the formal curricula?
Oh, that's a nice question. It's an easy one to answer, isn't it? Because no, Not enough is being done in the formal curricula. I mean, I don't know what your experiences have been, but I've found that attempting to produce really interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary programs is extremely challenging, because to do it properly, you've got to teach across departments or faculties or colleges. And universities are typically not set up to do that. They are centered around disciplinary excellence, academic excellence, which can be very, very narrow. And as Jordan was talking about earlier, he very nearly fell through the gaps, and I look at my university or other universities I've worked at, other universities I studied at, and you can see entire generations of young people having no exposure whatsoever to perhaps the greatest set of interconnected issues that they will ever experience. I mean, if we're serious about it's one of the greatest challenges in all of human history, then surely it's going to be the greatest challenge that they're going to face. And they can come away from their 3 years, maybe 4 years of higher education almost entirely unscathed. So something is desperately wrong has gone there. Now, in my home institution at the University of Exeter, we do a program called Grand Challenges, which is very popular. It takes students from across the university, it puts them into interdisciplinary teams, it gets them to work on particular challenges. And I think that's a good start. But above and beyond these kind of optionals, these nice to haves, we do need to enrich the curricula. We do need to embed it in the curricula. And I'm afraid to say there is still some resistance to doing that, because there is still some attitude that universities shouldn't be doing that. They should be teaching the subject. Maybe it's a subject that they were taught. Maybe it's a subject which is in part defined by an external certifying body, or in terms of what they think the employers want. But really, the last thing I'll say, I could talk about this all day, right? But what I will say is, when you look at graduate attributes, when you look at what graduate employers want, they want people who can work in diverse teams, address complex, wicked problems, be innovative problem solvers, exactly the kind of things that we need to solve the social environmental crisis. So you do both things. So there's still a lot of resistance, but I think there's an increasing appetite from young people to do this kind of transformative research. So I am ultimately optimistic about what we can do.
Super, thank you, James. The last question then is in, and I'm going to put this one to Jordan first, and then also to Wolfgang. This one comes from Aaron Thierry, who I mentioned earlier, who authored the really interesting paper talking about from publications to public actions. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. Right, can you point to examples of good practice in universities that we could try to expand or emulate? Jordan first.
Yeah, well, this is what we all need more of, right? And hopefully there'll be a lot more of that coming out of Faculty for a Future. So, do make sure to follow us, engage with us. We want to inspire as amid everything else that we're doing. And there are loads of examples out there already. I mean, it was great to see Stephen at Unity College in Maine give his story about divesting its endowment from fossil fuel companies. Of course, we need more to do that. And it reminds me of Adam Aaron. He's an example of somebody that's been taking action in all sorts of domains, leading a lot of incredible divestment work at UC San Diego. That you can find information about that online. And I think I saw in the chat about somebody saying, what can I do if my work is not maybe directly relevant to the crisis, e.g. neuroscience? Well, Adam Aaron is an example of somebody who was in exactly your position. Sorry, I didn't quite capture the name, but maybe somebody else can knock it in the chat. Adam Aaron, I think Wolfgang shared the link. He basically left his essentially eternal neuroscience, health-based neuroscience grant to set up a lab that explores the psychology of collective action. So really looking at what conditions in real life people are motivated to get up and try and put their voice and their body in motion to bring systemic transformation, and crucially in a university context. So really, it can feel like you can be miles away, but if you have a passion and you want to turn your expertise to, even just whether it's reorienting it 10 degrees, there are ways, I think, to start to think about how you can make what you're doing more relevant to the crisis, and that's one of the things that the research network is designed to do, is to facilitate collaboration, so that people already in this space can help out people who are looking to enter into it for the first time. I mentioned Nate Hagen's as well. He's been doing his Reality 101 system synthesis work at University of Minnesota, and he is shortly due to bring online all of his material to be accessible for free for academics and students all around the world. So we will definitely keep you in touch with that if you sign up to our newsletter. And I think maybe what I haven't done is really touch a huge amount on research other than Adam Aaron. I know Wolfgang's got an example if we've got time.
I think they are very practical solutions that really cut through these complicated discussions. And I'd like to mention one academic that we spoke to as part of a research for the research hub. His name is Vishwas Zatzgar. He's at Witwatersrand University, and he set up at least two extremely interesting projects. One is the Emancipatory Future Studies in the Anthropocene project at the university, and it does something quite similar to what we want to do. He's already, if we can paste the link, he's already mapped out projects that we want to attract as well in academia globally. And he's also co-founder of the South African Climate Justice Charter movement. Well, one thing I really want to pin down is, and we're talking about what can we do about this crisis, and it's all so complex, and we've been talking a lot about net zero and about fossil fuels and all that. But however, going back to Laurie, so where is the trigger? If things get really, really wrong, where is the most important thing? And that's something that Vishwas actually showed us around his lab virtually on his phone. And he was really so engaged and he was so enthusiastic about his work and our initiative. And this is the Food Sovereignty Lab that they have set up there. And in South Africa, their students actually go hungry into class, and they're used to just feed them somewhere in the parking lot. And now they've started gardening on the grounds of Witwatersrand University. They've set up a building where they can cook. They've got initiative with local growers, and this is kind of linking that with academia is one of the things we want to do.
Thanks, Wolfgang. I'm really glad you shared that. But yes, we are running out of time, sadly. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We've got so much engagement in the chat. We really appreciate that. And we're sorry that we couldn't get to all of the questions. If yours wasn't answered, we'll endeavor to email you and answer it in the coming days. And the full recording and edited highlights will be available on our YouTube channel later in the week if you want to watch it again or share it with others. I guess I hope that this is not the end of our journey, but the start of our journey together. Our website has now launched. You can already sign up to our upcoming hub launch events and to participate in our projects. And again, there's really something to fit everyone, I hope. So no matter your place in and around the academic sphere or how much time you have free, please, we'd love you to get involved. We'd love you to sign up to our newsletter as well, the first edition of which will be launching on Friday. And also, please give us feedback. So I think the survey that I mentioned at the start is going to be posted into the chat now, and the chat log with the survey and everything else will be emailed to you all. And if you'd like to get in touch about anything else, please do via the website. One final ask of you all, please, if you could help us spread the word, that would be incredibly appreciated. We're only as strong as the coherence and the size of our community, and with lots of people chipping in, we can start to change the shape of academia on an institutional scale. So if you've got a Twitter following, please shoot out a tweet on our behalf. If you're in a network with people you think would be interested in our community, let them know. We'd really appreciate all you can do to help us grow together, and crucially, to help us find the answers, right? Because we don't have all the answers, and we really want this to be a collaborative effort. So thank you so much for coming, and hopefully we will see you soon.